Welcome to another episode of Becoming a Techno Wizard. And today we're back with the Phenomenology of Spirit by Hegel. It's been way too long since I did this last one. So just before this, I went back and listened to the last episode. Um, so if you missed it, or if you don't remember, if you don't know what I'm talking about, please feel free to go back and watch the old ones, whether directly from Gregory B. Sadler, Dr. Sadler here, or from my own videos. So yeah, I'm just reading through his read through of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit and trying to understand and grasp it and play with this idea. Get into the notion, the concept of trying to wrap my head around these concepts, these systems of philosophies, these truths, and everything like that. It's been really enjoyable, and unfortunately, I was just doing a lot of other stuff. You can find out in my newsletters and my audio journals to see what else I've been doing. But anyways, without further ado, let's just, as Philip would say, let's just jump into it. That's not what he says. Dive into it. I forget already. Anyways, ooh, I just whoa now. My audio is coming out the wrong area. There we go. Better.
If we apprehend a demand of this kind in its broader context and view it as it appears at the stage which self-conscious spirit has presently reached, it's
Hold up.
clear that spirit
I'm already
has
behind.
now got beyond the
Let me get in the right mind space for this. This is why I appreciate Dr. Sadler here, describing these things, which he's going to do after this, because this is a lot of big words, and I have to get myself into that mindset once again of comprehending this thing. So let me see. If we apprehend a demand of this kind in its broader context and view it as it appears at the stage which self-conscious spirit has presently reached, it is clear that spirit has got beyond the substantial life it formerly led in the element of thought. Oh yeah, so right. So all of this is, again, this is all the preface, right? It's picking up from where he left off, and he left off and beginning to kind of critique the philosophy at the time, which is the idea of the notion of things, of how you can't really understand a thing in and of itself. You have to intuitively, you know, feel it, experience it. And I think what he was saying in the last section was that the idea that you can't understand something, but you have to experience it, right, is flawed, because we as humans, I don't think he mentioned this specific, but kind of how I interpret it is that we as humans kind of are built to be curious about these things and to try and explain these things and try to, describe the world that we live in. And so in order to grasp these concepts, we can't just be okay with just experiencing it and just intuiting it, but we have to we seek to create an entire system around it, right, to understand the mechanisms of how everything works. And so to really the whole idea of the phenomenology of spirit, as I am understanding so far, is to create a system of philosophy, right? So you can actually say whether or not this entire philosophical system is accurate or is a realistic interpretation of the world by seeing the mechanisms of that system. Um, yeah, so what he's getting to right now, it seems that if we apprehend the demand of this kind in its broader context, the demand of this kind meaning the demand of creating that system, creating that structure, right, in which we can understand those mechanisms. Because as appears a stage which self-conscious spirit has presently reached, it is clear that the spirit has got beyond the substantial life. Yeah, so I'll let him continue.
substantial life it formerly led in the element of thought, that it is beyond the immediacy of faith, beyond the satisfaction and security of the certainty that consciousness then had of its reconciliation with the essential being and of that being's universal presence both within and without. It is Not only gone beyond all this into the other extreme of an insubstantial reflection of itself into itself, but it also beyond that too. Spirit has not only lost its essential life, it is also conscious of this loss
Mm.
and of the finitude that is its own content. Turning
Infinitude.
away from the empty husks
All right, I'll let him finish
and
in a bit. But
confessing that it lies.
yeah, that idea right there of the spirit talking about faith, I think he's getting into like this idea of, because remember, all of the kind of previous philosophical precepts or things in his time, to my understanding, I don't know, I'm not a philosopher, I haven't studied all these different works and peoples and all this. I'm diving into this almost cold, right? I'm just diving into this just because it interested me, and it somebody listened in the comments, and I was like, oh, let me check that out. And it's been really interesting, even in the preface so far. So I'm probably not coming at this from the right, education, but it's fun for me to do, so I'm gonna do it. um but it seems he's talking about like the spirit, the like where he says here the faith, um has got beyond the substantial life it formerly led in the element of thought, that is beyond the immediacy of faith, beyond the satisfaction and security of the certainty that consciousness had. So getting back to the idea that, in order to understand concepts like big ideas of the world, right, you have to experience it, you have to intuit it, right? I think he wants to go beyond that, because you can't just take it by faith. You can't just be like, oh yes, this is how things work because this is how I experience it, or this is, you know, this is how it feels. He wants to create a system. Once again, he wants to create understand the mechanisms as to why it works, how it works, and then by doing so, we can have a better idea of that experience, right? Of what the truth truly is. And it's interesting because this gets into, psychology. This gets into even neurochemistry, where we show that our perceptions of the world is not necessarily accurate, right? Our perceptions of the world is one filter, and that filter is in and of itself prone to a lot of manipulation, a lot of um skewing of perception, because it's limited, right? It's limited to our perception, our sensory organs, our eyes and ears and mouth and all this other stuff, right? It's limited. What we're seeing, this goes back to, I talked about this in my audio journal. I know I'm going all over the place, but in my I went to a kind of virtual meetup this morning with some polymaths, some other folks who have interest in a lot of different areas, right? And they mentioned how it was so funny because we see the world in like a postage stamp, right? It's like due to our sensory organs, and many people who are not polymaths, especially who don't have interest in very many fields, they see things as reducible to one thing, to saying, oh, this is the one cause of something, this is the one way this works, this is the singular thing, and we have domains of expertise, and we say this is my domain, and we look at everything through that lens. The problem there is that it's too limited, right? It's literally looking through the world through a postage stamp, in that there's so much more to know. Everything is interconnected. Everything is, it's just so much more. And likewise for like the human brain, the human brain itself is, seeing the world through a postage stamp. It's limited in its ability to perceive everything. And then the brain, right? The brain is limited to understanding everything. And so we have this difference, this dichotomy between the conscious mind and the unconscious mind, because it's the unconscious mind that takes all these perceptions, all these sensory, organs that we have, and tries to parse that data, right? Tries to parse that data. And the conscious mind is like the little thing on top that tries to draw patterns between all those data, and tries to pull out specific things, and allow, and that's what allows us to kind of experience life. And so when you realize that all these layers of abstraction is kind of layered on top of each other, you can kind of see why, it has to go beyond faith. It has to go beyond, the as he says here, the security of the certainty that consciousness has. Like our conscious mind is only aware of such an incredibly small fraction of, reality. So we have to go beyond that to really describe and understand more of reality. I think that's what he's getting to. I might be completely wrong, but that's what I'm looking. That's how I see it so far.
In and without. It has not only gone beyond all this into the other extreme of an insubstantial reflection of itself into itself, but it also beyond that too. Spirit has not only lost its essential life, it is also conscious of this loss and of the finitude that is its own
That's
content.
so beautiful right there. I know we just read that, but like is also conscious of this loss. That's beautiful. Because like it's true. Like many of us know this. Like everything I just told you, many of us know this. Like we know that obviously we can't see everything, we can't perceive everything. And when we try to ignore that fact, right? In order to get through life, we try to ignore the fact that we're actually not seeing most of what we think we're seeing. And sometimes that we do a little bit too good of a job with that, right? We do a little bit too good of a job at ignoring the fact that our consciousness, our perception is only a smidgen, is only a fraction of what's really out there, right? But when you actually take some time to reflect on the matter, you realize that, oh man, I don't know anything. Like I thought I knew so much about the world, but there's so much more out there. You know, we think it's when we get those times to reflect and to think about all of this that's out there that we realize how much is lost. So yeah, that's amazing.
Turning away from the empty husks and confessing that it lies in wickedness, it reviles itself for so doing and now demands from philosophy not so much knowledge of what it is as the recovery through its agency of that lost sense of solid and
Mm.
substantial being.
So it seems like what he was saying right there is that we not now demands from philosophy not so much knowledge of what is what is as what is as that's kind of weird. Yeah, so not so much the knowledge, like we're not really seeking to learn not necessarily seeking to learn the knowledge of everything that's out there, but kind of recovering from the fact that we come from all this, like our atoms in our, maybe he wasn't taking this from this perspective, but this is how I'm interpreting it today with my modern idea of the world. But my current day idea of the world, because you might be viewing this in 100 years or maybe not, I don't know, whatever. But like we know today that our bodies and our minds comes from billion-year-old atoms, right? Like we come from the universe, we are the universe in a way. And this conscious mind, it can only see, can only perceive, can only experience so much of it. And it's like philosophy is kind of like an attempt, to me, seems like what he's saying here is an attempt to get back to that, to recover, that lost universality of everything. And it's kind of a doomed effort, because it's highly unlikely that we ever be able to do all that. Like we're not going to be omnipotent, omniscient, but we can still try, right? We can still make the effort to learn more and everything like that. Now I need to
Its
keep going.
agency of
A
that
minute
lost
in.
sense of solid and substantial being. Philosophy is to meet this need not by opening up the fast locked nature of substance and raising this up to self-consciousness, not by bringing consciousness out of its chaos back to an order based on thought, nor to the simplicity of the notion, but rather by running together what thought is put asunder by
Mm,
suppressing the differentiations of the notion and restoring the feeling of essential being.
mm.
In short, by providing edification rather than insight. The beautiful, the holy, the eternal.
Edification, what does that mean? I think I know. It's like the feeling of, or the experience, I guess, kind of like what he was saying before. The instruction or improvement of a person morally or intellectually. Interesting. The idea that art's main purpose is to find moral of an education. It's designed to improve you in some way, morally, educationally, spiritually. Oh, okay. Yeah.
Eternal, religion, and love are the bait required to arouse the desire to bite. Not the notion, but ecstasy.
Mm.
Not the cold march of necessity in the thing itself, but the ferment of enthusiasm. These are supposed to be what sustains and continually extends the wealth of substance.
Mm. That is beautiful right there. Yeah. Like you hear that all the time, today, like, in ideas like chase your passion, curiosity is like the root of education and drive and motivation, and to the fire to want to learn more is being curious, right? And it's because something deep inside us, you know, is driven by that curiosity. Much of our intelligence, much of our existence, our society is built on that curiosity. And I like how he says it here, is that it's because it's inherently enjoyable, right? We have an ecstasy when we are curious about things, and when we go to chase things, and we resolve to learn more about things. It's kind of an ecstasy where we experience that beauty, that joy, that edification, right? It's really incredible, and that's what I feel too when I'm reading this. Is like, it's the edification, it's the joy of things, it's the attempt at understanding more, even if it's beyond you. It's the attempt to do so which drives you to keep doing it. And hopefully, again, we can kind of build towards having that system, having a better understanding of the world, and having all that knowledge. But that's not necessarily the goal, right? The goal is not necessarily the knowledge in and of itself. It's the journey of curiosity. It's of learning more, and improving ourselves, and becoming more a part of the world and the universe and all this other stuff. Again, maybe I'm putting my own, current day ideas about it, but that's how I see it so far.
So section 7 continues this discussion in section 6 about intuition as a possible way to try to approach the absolute. And it begins by a little bit of history of ideas that you might not exactly know where to locate. So that's part of what I want to do from the start. He says spirit is gone past its substantial life in thought. And he talks about a few modes in which this has taken place. And what Hegel's really talking about here is what's going on in terms of changing consciousness in Europe. And some of this is economic, some of this is political, some of this is directly within the realm of philosophy and the development of the sciences, including those that deal with religion. So remember, what is substantial life? It's this sort of taken for granted, almost natural attitude where, look, this is just the way things are, and a lot of things aren't being examined, aren't being questioned, they're being assumed. So some of the ways in which this was taking place, even in the realm of thought, was with what Hegel called the immediacy of faith. If you think about Christian Europe and this conception of Christian Europe that pervaded the Middle Ages. There were plenty of people who didn't believe, by the way. All you got to do is read, some of the struggles that monks went through, or read about some of the crazy stuff that went on among the laity of that time, and you realize that the age of faith was not an age of universal faith. Mm. But if you wanted to begin from that sort of starting point, it was fairly unproblematic, as opposed to, once the Enlightenment had been going on for quite a while, and the erosion that took place because of that. Mm. Hegel also talks about the satisfaction.
And even today, a lot of people would love to start from a foundation of faith, and like, yes, it is because man in the sky put it there and stuff like that. Like, I come from that background, so I understand it. But yeah, I'd rather not start there, because again, it kind of divorces you from, at least in my opinion, it seems to divorce people from the effort of understanding, the effort of asking those questions and being curious. It's because why would you be curious if all the answers can be found in this little book, right? If all the answers are bestowed upon you by the higher one or whatever, like it kind of erodes the effort and the enjoyment, the ecstasy of having that curiosity. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe other folks will tell me different. But I've been raised in the church. I know a lot of people who just aren't curious, right? And I'm sure there are plenty of religious people who are curious and who go a step beyond and all this stuff. Like I've seen, like one of my favorite pastors in church is this fellow by the name of I think it's Brother Boyd. I believe that was the name. And he was extremely like curious. He was one of the best kind of pastors I've ever known. And maybe if my church experience had more of his type of thing, I would have kept some of that. But I doubt it. But anyways, it was still enjoyable because like you can see his passion and the curiosity. Like he would, even when he read the Bible, and he didn't just look at the words, he looked at, try to tell a story, try to understand the context and map it to our lives today, and dive into all these other things and all this other stuff. But most people, right, don't do that. Most other pastors don't do it. Most other, the deacons, the all these other people in the church, right, they just don't go to that extent. So I do think it is rare that that curiosity is valued with faith, with religion, and things like that. Yeah, but anyways,
and security of certainty that its consciousness had. So the thinker at the time of even say Descartes or Hobbes, boldly driving off on new paths, talking about totally reforming philosophy from the ground up. Both of them, by the way, talking about doing that. And both of them actually did for the philosophy that they did. They're still actually marked to a certain extent, even as much as they engage in doubt, by a kind of satisfaction and security of certainty in what it is that they're able to think out. Many other people, of course, are not engaging in Descartes' hyperbolic doubt, and they get their categories of thought supplied to them, and they just work with those, and they think, yeah, these are it. This is what works.
See it all the time.
He also talks about a reconciliation with essential being and its presence inside and outside of us. What do we mean by this? God in the Middle Ages.
Right.
Humanity, perhaps, if you abandon God, but you're still an optimistic person about human nature or something like that, the way a lot of Enlightenment materialist types were. I suppose even, the realm of the libertines and pleasure could fit into this in a certain way, although they tend to be a little bit more morose, and Hegel will treat them a bit later on. So, why bring all this up? Because this isn't going to work anymore. I mean, you could go back to it if you want, but you're living a pipe dream, Hegel would say. The Enlightenment is not something you can turn back. Its corrosive effect upon human consciousness is not something that you can undo. To use an old expression, you can't unring that bell. So this has been lost.
Seemed like
now,
it
not totally
comeback today, unfortunately.
There's still what Hegel calls the dry husks, empty husks. He says, spirit has not only gone beyond all this into the other extreme of an insubstantial reflection. I need to put that down. Insubstantial reflection of itself into.
Sorry, I'm gonna have to speed this up. My intention, it's hard to stay attentive with that a little bit of going a little faster here.
Itself. This is something very, very, very different. I can't stress that enough. Insubstantial. Human consciousness realizes its own lack of being the center of things. That it can't necessarily rely on its own judgments as being what's truly real. Descartes would fit into this now to a certain extent in terms of what his doubt does. de Sade would actually fit into this. All these other characters.
So many people, I gotta look these
who are realizing Pascal as well. Man is a thinking reed. Reflection of itself into itself.
Real quick, it's interesting. This is unrelated, but like all these people he mentioned, I know I have heard of some of them, but mostly in like science and mathematics, like Pascal's triangle. I think that's what he was talking about. You know, I heard of Descartes from some of his philosophical leanings, but it's interesting that many of these, past philosophers, and I think he mentioned that before in the beginning of this whole series, is that many of these past philosophers were themselves like scientists, or like, well, not just philosophers, but like, studied it from a scientific, kind of viewpoint. And it's kind of unfortunate that today many of our scientists are kind of divorced from philosophy and kind of poo-poo philosophy. They see it as like, oh, it's whatever, so, there's no real value there. But many of the, foundational scientists in our society, in our Western societies today, use philosophy as an important part of their thinking process and their scientific process as well. And that's really unfortunate that that has been eroded. Um, and I hope we kind of see a comeback of that. I've seen, some folks today that kind of, are getting more into that. Um, but I don't know. Just an interesting observation.
Now, when we say this term reflection, we automatically think of mirrors. Hegel thinks of reflection in two other ways, and so it's important to stress this at the beginning while we're sort of working on our main concepts. You could think of it in terms of mirrors. You can also think of it as the act of reflection, to thinking about something, right, which generates something new in the process. And you can also think of reflection, especially when it's this reflection of itself into itself, which is already marked by a kind of reflexivity, right? Itself into itself.
Self-reflection.
Yeah, as a kind of movement, a movement of mind, sort of folding back in upon itself. So this is what spirit or human consciousness is reduced to. This is to be quite alienated, to experience this, as opposed to being in your substantial life. Even if you're in a crappy position in the life world that you inhabit, all you're doing is doing the menial jobs and being treated as if you're, less than human. You still have some things you can take for granted. You still know where you fit. This is something quite different. And Hegel's not saying that this doesn't happen before the Enlightenment, but he thinks that it's not a widespread enough phenomenon for us to take notice of. In the Enlightenment, though, this is sort of the dark side of the Enlightenment. So he says, spirit has lost its essential life, and it's conscious of this loss. It's conscious of the estrangement between substantial life, the way things used.
Yeah, this is interesting. I know I'm pausing a lot. This is the whole point. You could go watch this yourself if you don't want like to pause. But I was taking this from, like I said, the universal concept and kind of idea of where consciousness is coming from. Because today I've been reading a lot about consciousness, and a lot of my current my mentality is focused on this idea of consciousness and where it comes from, and where and the mechanisms of it. Us trying to explain consciousness through a scientific lens today. However, it's important to realize that in his time, right, much of consciousness was kind of explained by faith, by ideas of a religion, or even folks that weren't necessarily religious, as a mechanistic kind of view, right, of the essence of things, right? Even though that seems like a religious concept nowadays, but even like back then, during the initial Enlightenment, again, I don't have enough education to really speak on this, but it seems that what he's getting to here, I know he's saying himself, but I'm trying to understand it for myself, is that how I'm interpreting what he's saying is that with the use of religion and the essence of things and the humanitarian kind of view of the world, this idea of the soul, right? Like the whole reason why we have the word of spirit or soul or whatever is to describe consciousness. It's to describe consciousness. And so when during the Enlightenment period, when people have started questioning these things and stuff like that, people begin to realize that we can't call this soul, this spirit, right, as a higher thing. We can't call it, like, there's so many people that have been stepping away from the idea of God, the idea of religion, and they realize they have to put something else there. It leaves a vacuum, as they say, right? It leaves a power vacuum, as they say. And so that's that insubstantial reflection, because it's because that idea of a God, of a higher being, is so powerful, and it's so broad, it's so wide ranging, that to divorce yourself from it requires you to put in more effort to do something more, right? To fill up that space. And in the attempts to do so, you realize how, like what he said, insubstantial your current ideas of that is. And I know people will look at that, especially like religious people will look at that and say, oh, that's why you shouldn't, step away from God, because there is no, whatever. But you're losing the point here, right? The point is not necessarily to say there is no God or whatever. For some people it is, but in my eyes, and perhaps maybe even Hegel, is to point out that it's again the effort, it's the curiosity, it's the exercise of doing so that is worth doing. Because without it, right, you, like what he said earlier, you get into a comfort of assuming that this is all that explains things, right? Like the soul, the spirit, this higher level stuff can all be explained by some God, and therefore you don't have to think about it too much, right? You don't have to worry about it too much. There's a God, right? And that's it. But it makes you lazy. It makes your mind kind of atrophy, because it's like sleeping on a bed that's too soft, right? You're sinking into it, and it's just like you're not, you're not your body's not really made for that. You have to exercise a little bit. It's like sitting down all day, right? It's very comfortable, right? It's very comfortable to sit down in this chair all day. But if you only do that, then you're going to atrophy. Your muscles are going to atrophy. You're not going to be able to move around as much and be more limber, be able to do more things with your body. Likewise with your mind, right? Like I think religion is you can kind of describe it as like the chair of the mind. This idea of God is like a chair of the mind. It's very easy to sit in and say, yes, this is it. I'm safe here. I'm secure here. I'm very comfortable here. But then if you just sit there all day, you're not going to be able to engage with the world. There's so much out there. You're not going to ask questions about the world, about why we're here and why the consciousness, the soul, whatever. You're just going to say, oh yes, it's God, right? And it doesn't allow you to explore more. But when you get up, right, when you get out of that chair, and you're trying to find new kind of areas of to not necessarily replace the chair, but to do something else with your body that's a comfortable level when you come to a rest or whatever. And I say that because we're not necessarily trying to replace the chair. We're not trying to replace the idea of God with another concept. You're trying to understand it, right? This is why it's silly to say, oh, this is why you can't, replace the idea of God or anything like that. It's because the point is not to replace it. The point is just try to understand, right? Just try to be curious. Just try to explain things and try to describe things. Try to be curious about everything. I say that word so many times by now, but I really think this is an important idea, and it's really interesting because like it gets to this problem of like, yeah, once you get out of this chair, you realize that you're trying to find other ways of moving your body, and maybe you want to sit down into a comfortable position, but then you realize that any other position that you have outside of a chair, it's really difficult to be in that position for a long period of time, right? And so then you have to ask yourself, dang, why is that, right? You can't just retreat back to the chair and just sit there for the rest of the day. You have to ask yourself, why am I so comfortable in that chair? Why can't I be comfortable standing up? Why can't I be comfortable crouching down? Why can't I be comfortable walking for a long period of time? All this other stuff. Like maybe I don't need a chair, or maybe I do. Maybe it's whatever, right? You just asking me all these questions. I know I'm getting all over the place with this, but I don't know. It's really sparking my mind here. So I don't know. Let's continue.
Used to be for it, which might be experienced in childhood, and then you grow out of childhood, and now you're this alienated scholar or government employee, and you're thinking to yourself, I don't know what the hell's going on anymore, and I don't know where I fit in. All I know is I can't go back to that. What am I? Am I a thinking reed, like Pascal said? Am I a sort of a combination of the greatest misery and also the greatest heights that are possible? I'm a paradox. This is a real problem. This is something that one can feel anguish about. So he says, turning away from the empty husks and confessing that it lies in wickedness. This is also where the origin of a certain kind of conception of evil comes from. That it reviles itself for so doing, and now demands from philosophy. So here's what we need to think about. What do we demand from philosophy? What are we looking for philosophy to give us? Are we looking for it to be a self-help book, to use the parlance of our own time? Are we looking for it to shoot us off into the absolute, to teach us some tricks, some mindfulness stuff that'll zap us right there, and we'll now feel a-okay about no longer being alienated, and we'll be back, maybe not in substantial life, but something even better, the absolute? He says philosophy is to meet this need, this recovery through its agency of the lost sense of solid and substantial being. Philosophy is to meet this need, and it can do it in two different ways. One is by conceptual knowledge, by the process that Hegel is himself outlining in the Phenomenology, by the hard work, the patience and labor of the negative, to use a catchphrase that we're going to come to fairly soon in this great work. Or does it attempt to do so through intuition? He says, by running together what thought is put asunder, by suppressing the differentiations of the notion, and restoring the feeling of essential being. I don't want to think about this stuff. I want to feel it. I don't want to be bothered with having to work my way through this stuff. That's not really the right stuff, man. You gotta have your heart in the right place. That's the sort of thing that Hegel is criticizing here.
Yo, this is hilarious because we see the same thing happening today with they call it narcissistic spiritualism, right? Where people go and meditate and do yoga and like, yeah, I'm in the right space, man. I'm just chilling. I'm just at one with the universe. You get to this point where people are like getting into an intuitive sense of belonging with the universe, and you're just in this feeling of the world, right? But no, that's not what we should be doing, because that's when you're literally replacing the chair with the chair. You're replacing the religion, the vacuum of religion, with another religion, with spiritualism, with whatever else, with it's not just spiritualism, it's politics, right? It's sports, it's freaking hedonism, right? You're just replacing the comfort of belonging, of thinking that this one thing describes the entire world, and replacing that with another thing that describes the entire world, thinking that instead of God, being the ultimate answer to everything, politics is the ultimate answer, economy is the ultimate answer, money is the ultimate answer, pleasure is the ultimate answer. Like, no, there's no absolute thing. I think this is what he's getting to, is that it's about the effort of trying to understand these things. Instead of replacing the chair, maybe you don't need the chair. Maybe you can stand up the whole time. Maybe you can be crouching down. Maybe you can be and it's going to be different for different contexts. It's going to vary depending on the context, depending on the situation, the circumstance, the age, whatever, right? But that's okay. You don't need a singular answer for everything. You don't need a singular source of truth or substantial life. Like, you don't need to feel comfortable with one answer, with this idea that this one thing describes everything else. You can go through the journey of trying to understand it yourself. All right. This is why I'm doing this myself, because I'm so far out of my bag here, but it's so enjoyable to try and grasp these concepts, because I think that's where the greater power is, right? That's where the greater experience is in trying to grapple with these concepts, trying to explain them, trying to describe them, trying to understand them, and put them in a system and all this other stuff, right? And improving that system, realizing that system will probably fall apart, and it's okay. We keep working on another one. All right, that's what keeps us active. That's what keeps us physically fit, mentally fit for our entire lives. So yeah, this is really incredible. Let's continue.
And he says, all sorts of things work as traps for this. This is what he calls edification. Or do we want edification, or do we want knowledge from philosophy? What are the traps or the baits? The beautiful, the holy, the eternal, religion, love. I would say in our own day, We could add some other words that are easier to relate to ourselves.
Oh, so that's what he was getting to say. Yeah, I did, misinterpret that in the beginning, where I thought he was referring philosophy to and the edification or the, things like that. It seems like what he was saying is like kind of the other way around, where um philosophy shouldn't be about the intuitive edification, or just or shouldn't be just for edification, shouldn't be just for beauty, love, this, all the other stuff. Like, all that is kind of experiences and intuitions and stuff like that. But philosophy in and of itself is the pursuit of that knowledge, right? It's the pursuit of things and stuff like that. So and still, yeah, it's funny because what I've been saying is kind of similar to that, but looking at it from a different perspective, from the other side of it. And maybe it shows you I'm wrong. Like, it's this is the journey, right? Of seeing how wrong you are, and then be like, oh wow, I need to adjust things. So yeah, um, I can see that approach too. That it's about that pursuit of knowledge, and yet that still kind of relates, right? That still kind of relates to what I was saying, because again, if you find so much comfort in just these feelings of these intuitive feelings of life, of love, happiness, pleasure, all this other stuff, then it makes it harder to pursue that knowledge. It's not like, I don't think he's saying that you can't experience those things, right? It's more that you can't base your pursuit of knowledge just in that. You can't just say, oh, all of knowledge or all of philosophy is to, explain love, right? Love is great. It's great, amazing experience. But when it comes down to understanding what love is, you can't just say love is feeling love. You can't say, oh, love is indescribable, and therefore, there's no point in describing it, right? You just have to experience. You have to just be there. Like, no, I think we can try to describe it, right? I think we can try to pursue that knowledge of describing what love is, and what it encompasses and what's not, and all this other stuff. So from that perspective, I can see that as well. So yeah,
Spirituality, the New Age, mindfulness.
right. This is what I just
All
said.
of those things for Hegel would be letting us down. Because here's the thing. When we ask, what do we demand from philosophy? Philosophy is a human activity. We're really asking, what do we demand from ourselves?
Mm.
Do we want to grow? Do we want to meet the absolute where it is by way of our own growth towards it, which has to take place through systematic conceptual knowledge,
Mhm.
through development, through philosophy? Or do we want to try to take shortcuts and feel like we're actually connected to the absolute, or something that matters, something that puts everything in perspective, something that makes sense out of this, admittedly,
Mm.
crappy position to be in? That's the choice that he's outlining there. You may not have noticed that the first time that you read through this passage, but this is really
I didn't,
a
right?
crux
See, I
point.
got that wrong.
This is one of his main criticisms of the, philosophy, if you want to call it that, of intuition. That it doesn't demand enough from philosophy, and it doesn't demand enough from ourselves.
Mm. Real quick too. I know so much pausing. Um, it's so interesting because when I've been looking at positive psychology, SB Kaufman, his book about transcendence, and he points out this Maslow's hierarchy of needs and the revised integrated model of this, and it shows that at the top of this, not really a pyramid, but at the once everything is combined, right? Once we have, not even once we have, but really kind of at the peak of our resistance, the peak of what it means to be us, is that transcendent feeling, right? That transcendent feeling of being one with others and all this other stuff. So this seems to be a deep psychology, a deep factor of the human mind and the human body of wanting to feel bigger, right? Wanted to feel connected to everything, right? But when you take those shortcuts, and and you see this in the Kaufman's book as well, when you take those shortcuts and you have what he calls is an unhealthy transcendence, where you, like I said earlier, you base your entire identity and your existence, your belonging to something bigger, in into something that doesn't really serve you. So for instance, sports or religion or politics or anything like that, right? You base your entire, your, that feeling of wanting to be one, that one feeling of wanting to be connected and to matter, right? To matter to the world, to make an impact, to be connected, to be part of something bigger. When you base that into all these other things that don't really engage you and don't really do anything good for you, right? That's where you have that unhealthy transcendence. That's where people can do great acts of unspeakable evil, right? And or just great acts of just laziness and just ineptitude or apathy or whatever, right? It's because you took shortcuts. It's because you didn't base your pursuit of knowledge and your pursuit of growth in something healthy, in a healthy grappling of the world. You allowed somebody else to describe what the world is. You allowed your sports team, your religion, your politics, your whatever other belief system to make those decisions for you, to describe what the world is for you. And because of that, you become, lazy. You become atrophied. And yeah, that oof, that's a huge point here. And it's so crazy to hear this dude talking about this. However, when was this written? Hegel is a couple hundred years ago, maybe. Let me look this up. Knowledge, Spirit, 1807. It was published in 1807. So yeah, over 200 years ago, and they had these similar problems. Wow.
In keeping with this demand is the strenuous, almost overzealous, and frenzied effort to tear men away from their preoccupations with the sensuous, from their ordinary private affairs, and to
Right.
direct their gaze to the stars, as if they had forgotten all about the divine and were ready like worms to content themselves with dirt and water.
Mm.
Formerly, they had a heaven adorned with a vast wealth of thoughts and imagery. The meaning of all that is hung on the thread of light by which it was linked to that heaven. Instead of dwelling in this world's presence, men looked beyond it, following this thread to an otherworldly presence, so to speak.
Ooh, this man spitting, bro. This man spitting. Hold up. So you said formerly they had a heaven adorned with a vast wealth of thoughts and imagery. Again, getting back to that chair, right? That religion is comfortable. It describes so much. You're like, yes, this is God. It's so great. Or if you don't want to use God, use freaking politics, use freaking capitalism, whatever else. But so often, right, that thing that you have, that you've grown up to believe is so much bigger, is describes everything. It's so comfortable. It seems like it describes the whole world, the whole universe. And so when you try to, get out of that, it feels cold, it feels hard, it feels depressing sometimes, because it's like, oh, what can I replace this all that, like this, it's like you're losing so much of that. And that's why you have to make that effort. You have to, warm yourself up by this process of learning, this process of going and trying to to grapple with everything.
Speak. The eye of the spirit had to be.
Oh man, my bad, I meant to continue here, but the meaning of all that is hung on the thread of light by which it was linked to heaven. Yep. Instead of dwelling in this world's presence, men look beyond it, following this thread to an otherworldly presence, so to speak. Yeah. So that's basically what I was saying.
Beyond it, following this thread to an otherworldly presence, so to speak. The eye of the spirit had to be forcibly turned and held fast to the things of this world. And it has taken a long time before the lucidity which only heavenly things used to have could penetrate the dullness and confusion in which the sense of worldly things was enveloped. And
Mm.
so to make attention to the here and now as such, attention to what has been called experience. An interesting and valid enterprise.
Ooh. Yeah. Yeah. Like it's when you let go of those things, when you let go of that idea that the world can be the eye of the spirit, as you said, the eye of the spirit had to be forcibly turned and held fast to things of this world, right? When you kind of let go of that thread of thinking that, these other things are transcendent, these other ideas are beyond you, and describe everything. You're kind of left looking at what we have here on this earth, and you have to make anew your appreciation for these things. You have to make anew your appreciation for the wider world and all this other stuff. And if you don't make that effort, right, if you continue to take those shortcuts, you're just going to find another threat to the heavens or whatever, right? You're just going to find another way to excuse yourself from making that effort. And they calls it like the experience, right? It's that feeling that, like, oh, it can't be described, you have to just feel it, you have to just be there. But maybe, again, maybe we should try to describe it, maybe we should try to get beyond there.
Nice. Now we seem to need just the opposite. Sense is no longer fast-rooted in earthly things. Sense is so fast-rooted in earthly things that it requires just as much force to raise it. The spirit shows itself as so impoverished that, like a wanderer in the desert craving for a mere mouthful of water, it seems to crave for its refreshment only the bare feeling of the divine in general.
Mm.
By the little which now satisfies spirit, we can measure the extent of its loss.
Mm. Hegel, man.
In this next paragraph,
Amazing.
section 8,
Dope.
Hegel is continuing to explore the mindset critically. He's going to criticize this, the mindset that demands that the absolute or reality or philosophy provide itself to the person in terms of intuition, in terms of something that would be graspable without having to put in a lot of time, work, labor, or perhaps just labor of a certain kind. And there's a lot going on in this section, but I want to just stop and sort of contextualize it a bit. Hegel has been criticizing this point of view, and why? Well, because it's prevalent at his own time. Some of the thinkers that are going to be looked at by English and American authors as transcendental philosophy, starting with Kant and then continuing through, are really going to be stressing this need to appeal to intuition. And as we pointed out before, this is not something radically new. Spinoza himself, with his third way of knowledge, Spinoza is really coming into vogue among authors at this time, after being in disrepute for quite a while. He's emphasizing that, and there's other people too. The mystic Jakob Böhme. I suppose you could say another mystic, Meister Eckhart, as well. But Nicholas of Cusa. There's many people out there talking about a higher form of knowledge, and the question is this going to be something that can be provided in terms of something like an intuitive leap away from the empirical, away from the historical, away from the everyday that we experience? Is it going to be something special that takes us into a starry beyond, to use Hegel's phrase? Or if we want to have what that's going to provide to us, because Hegel does think there is something there, does it have to kind of integrate itself with the realm that it seems to want to leave behind? That's the challenge that Hegel is posing in this section, and in the previous section where he was criticizing this appeal to intuition as well. So he's framing the way in which they see things, and in this section he's saying something that to a certain degree he endorses, but to a certain degree he is presenting merely to sort of put it out there as a incomplete position that will be taken up by his own position. So he says, in keeping with this demand, what's the demand? That the absolute be given in terms of intuition, is the strenuous, almost overzealous and frenzied effort to tear men away from their preoccupation with the sensuous, sensibility, the ordinary private affairs, and to direct their gaze to the stars, to something that's higher, something that is more universal, away from the particular towards the universal. And we have a antithesis being set up here, one that's particularly acute in modernity, after the Enlightenment, during the middle of the massive changes that are occurring within the economy with globalization, although they didn't know it was globalization quite yet, and the Industrial Revolution, with new political forms. This is soon after the French Revolution, after the American Revolution, after the developments in Britain, and there's interesting things going on in Germany. So there's a lot of ferment right now, and the question is, should people be paying attention to the world of the experiential, the empirical, which is also to a certain...
Ooh, let me pause real quick. I just had to say this. It's so interesting, once again, that it's kind of a tangent here, but that time was so so much was going on in that time. Like today in the 21st century, we hear this all the time that we're living in the kind of greatest time of change ever. Um, but that's not necessarily true, right? Like in his time in the 1800s, that was extremely crazy time to be alive, right? And that there's so much change happening in that time, like really radical change. French Revolution, the start of the Renaissance, like he said, and all this other stuff. Um, and that's wild, right? The Industrial Revolution is starting up, like all these crazy, time periods and happenings is happening in that time, and the 1900s, it's another huge part. I mean, like the early 1901 to 1920, right? Leading into the whole Gilded Age and all this other stuff. Another crazy time, right? And now in the early 2000s, it's another. It is a crazy time. Don't get me wrong. There's a lot of change happening, but it. I would be curious to see, if we plot all the data, right? If we made some data points about radical changes happening, which of these timelines or which of these time periods are really the most radical, the most with the most change happening. I really wonder how that will play out. Um, and that's just, what he was saying here. Most of that is mostly in the Western world, right? But people don't rarely ever talk about what's going on in Africa at that time, right? Like a lot of in that time, there was a huge um, kind of shift from these African kingdoms that were in their golden ages from antiquity for thousands of years up to this point where they were falling apart due to, internal strife in politics, as well as the European kind of Europeans coming in and the use of guns and all this other stuff, the slavery, of course. Like there was massive change going on in Africa, which a lot of people don't talk about. I know why, because people think that Africa has no history, basically. But in reality, Africa was some of the had some of the greatest sources of ideas for a long period of time, right? And the a lot of the Romans, a lot of the Greeks, they went to Africa. They went to different places in Africa to learn, right? As a place of learning. And of course, much of that is completely like ignored these days. And even that assertion, even that idea is something that people will poo-poo. They won't really engage with that idea. But when you look into history, you see that, right? And I'm not too well versed in Far Eastern things or South American things, but I wonder what was going on there too, right? What was going on in all these other Aboriginal places? Like what was going on in Australia or whatever, right? Like I wonder what are we missing in terms of these ideas? Because especially when we're trying to get to this point of describing things and understanding the world beyond ourselves, we have to also understand that our Western ideas are in and of itself a perspective, right? Or a limited kind of perspective of the world. And oftentimes, like the Western idea is kind of vaunted as a divine sort of ideal. Oftentimes, where we say, oh, the how we think about the world is seen as a comfortable positioning, as our language or our culture or history or whatever is so great, and the way of thinking, our way of abstract thought is the only way of abstract thought or whatever, when in reality there's a lot of other cultures, like, right, once again, African cultures that had different ways of using abstract thought, right? It had different types of abstract thought, where it wasn't just a kind of functional relationship between, or rather, it was a functional relationship as opposed to a categorical relationship, which is what you find in a lot of Western thoughts. Uh, and I know I'm going way down a tangent here, but I do think it's related still. Um, but for instance, in the Western idea of abstract thought, we have this idea of when we categorize something, when we, describe things, we say, oh, this is a knife, and this is a fork, and this is a fruit, and this is a plate, whatever. We put those in different categories um, in comparison to their function or comparison to how it's used or how it's made or something like that, right? But in many African people, like many African languages and societies, they had a whole different abstract thought where they said, this is a knife and this is a fruit, but there's a language, there's a word they use to describe a knife used for cutting fruit, right? Where you use like you categorize a knife by whether it's used to cut fruit or if it's used for killing people, right? And so the word for knife would be a word for knife cutting fruit, or knife for war, right? Even though it's still a knife, like in the Western world, we would categorize it as a knife and then augmented based on the different use case or whatever. But in a lot of the African languages, they would use it based on the word itself would be structured around the function, the use case in and of itself. Again, it's so hard to explain this, right? It's so hard to, you probably don't even know what I'm talking about. You probably think it's silly, but if you really think about this is kind of an ingenious way of explaining the world, because it encourages you to see the systems, right? To see the inherent systems of things, and to see how things are interconnected from a fundamental level, right? People don't realize that. Like today, we have too much of an issue of a reductive thinking, of thinking that this is the essence of thing. This is the one thing that's used for, and or this is one way you describe something, and you can only use it in this case or that case or whatever. Um, and that kind of, and because of that, we came up with language. We came up with words like nature, right? With describing the natural world as separate from the human world or something like that. Like it's so weird that we came up with words to describe, to separate us from everything else going on in the world. And that is kind of wild when you realize that, you know because when you look at the world, you realize that everything that we have, this internet, all this, is still nature, right? It's not like it's unnatural. It didn't pop out of nowhere. It didn't just boom and then it popped up. Like, no, people made these things. It's made of materials from the quote unquote natural world, from the ground, right? And these materials are used to create these different things and all this other stuff. And it's just so silly that we have a different word for quote unquote nature and us and our life here. And that's problematic because it it makes it difficult for us to get to things like this, and understanding how our world on this earth, on like the ordinary life, is not divorced from the wider world, is not divorced from nature, maybe not even divorced from the universe, right? Like we're still atoms, we're still a whole bunch of molecules, you know in a certain shape, in a certain form. We're intimately connected with the universe, but it's extremely difficult to describe that connection with our current Western language in a way that is not purely experiential and spiritual, right? It's difficult. I just said we're running with the universe, and people might hear that and be like, "Oh, this is kind of a woo woo." I No, it's not a woo woo. It's literally science. It's literally our atom. What do you think our atoms come from? Like, and it's crazy because it's just so difficult to really describe these things with our language. And I think this problem here he's getting to of trying to you know separate or kind of learn, get into the everyday experience of our life, and versus like the divine and beyond and all that stuff, is because our language, right? We have an inherent language problem. And I know he was German, he didn't have this English, but even in German, like German is still based on a, I think, a Greco-Roman kind of alphabet, and it's a deeper thing than just English. It's a it's all of these Western languages, starting from the Roman, Greeks, and all this other stuff, and we're divorced from having a kind of oral education system versus a written language, and that written language kind of encourages you to be excessively reductive with the way you describe things, because you have to, like, you can't explain the entire world in a sentence, like in a letter. You have to it making a language, especially one that's not pictographic, kind of requires you to divorce things and to categorize things excessively, and to be a little bit reductive in your language, in order to write it down. But oral languages don't necessarily have that. Like, you can pass along messages and ideas through the oral way, through tone, through movement, right? Through music, through all these other methods that encapsulate so much about the knowledge and the information that we're trying to pass along, that can't that doesn't have to be reduced so much like when you get into written language. Oh my gosh, but yeah, anyways. I know it was a huge tangent there, but once again, I think it is really interesting and important to think about, because once again, these languages here, like these words that we have, are structures in and of itself, and are themselves limitations, are themselves perspectives in which limit and constrain our idea, our ability to truly understand things. And again, that doesn't mean that we can only have an intuitive sense. Once again, I agree that we shouldn't depend on a purely intuitive sense of understanding the world. I just think that the way in which we use our language today makes it difficult to explain and to describe things that are not intuitive, right? Or that are intuitive, even, or rather, I think that's what I mean to say, is that for feelings that are intuitive, that like love, like transcendence, like, for feelings that are hard to describe with words, it's hard to describe with words. But due to our language, but in other languages and other cultures, I would be curious to see, right, if they can describe things from a logical, abstract way of explaining things beyond just intuition, right? I would be curious to see that. I think they can, because once again, in many African nations, they use like things like fractal math, right? They were able to create entire cities and structures based on that idea, even though they didn't necessarily have the same level of, I don't want to say abstract or logic, or like they had a different way of understanding and using fractal math and all this other stuff other than math, and as we know it today. But they were able to use it in a practical sense. So it had to be, in my mind, it had to be beyond just intuitiveness. It had to be beyond just intuitive understanding of the world, because you need a functional you need an abstract understanding of something in order to use it in different contexts and different environments. And that's what a lot of those people did. So I'm really curious to see, what were those other ways? How did they do that? Maybe I might be wrong. I don't know, but I'm curious to see what that was like. Let's continue.
To an extent, the private, my experience is my experience. I can only experience my portion. I can read about your experience, but I can't directly experience it. Should we focus just on the world, or should we look to what people had focused on before? And when you actually read, say, ancient history or medieval history, you find that the representations that moderns give of it are usually very one-sided and, I won't say romantic, but romanticized. And the way that this views things is, this is where people are focused today. This is where they used to be focused. They'd focus on the divine. They'd focus on what was beyond the world, what was metaphysical, what was eternal. They'd focus on what he calls, beautiful phrase here, a heaven adorned with a vast wealth of thoughts and imagery. So, for an example of this, think of, if you've ever seen it, there's a beautiful icon in the Sloat Gallery at Notre Dame University. And there's others, I believe, like this. And it shows, this icon depicts the orders of the angels in heaven. And so it's depicting heaven as this dynamic liturgy where all these different things are going on and they're all interconnected, and human beings themselves can play some sort of small role in this, where human beings are not really the center of let's say the universe, because even the universe isn't the center of the universe. If we mean by universe that which is most real, that which is ultimately grounding everything else, that which has the highest value. Now, that would be an example of what Hegel is calling this heaven adorned with a vast wealth of thoughts and imagery. And like he says, with this understanding of things, people will say, ancient wisdom, or, it was becoming quite popular to talk about medieval times at that time, which, medieval times, if you actually read the histories and read the letters that people wrote, were actually quite secular. But there was this conception that people were more attuned to the supernatural, to the beyond the worldly, to the transcendent. back then, and the real
I'm trying to find that icon he's talking about. I don't think this is it. This don't look very yeah, I'm not sure what he's talking about. I don't know. Let's continue.
task was to get them to actually pay attention to this stuff. This is a very modern conception of modernity, by the way. It's one that actually doesn't fit the facts quite so well, and that's perhaps why Hegel is a little bit loath to endorse it entirely. And he does say that these other people are sort of projecting that as their raison d'etre for why their approach is the right approach. So he says the eye of the spirit had to be forcibly turned and held fast to the things of this world. That's the force of secularization. It's taken a long time before the lucidity, which only heavenly things could have, could penetrate the dullness and confusion which the sense of worldly things was enveloped in, to pay attention to the here and now. And he says this was a sort of progress, because now they're actually paying attention to, and he brings up this key word here, experience, the realm of experience, as opposed to the metaphysical, that which is beyond just mere experience. And so there's this movement away from that towards this, and now what we need is a counter movement back towards this. And so he says, now we seem to need just the opposite. Sense is so fast-rooted in earthly things, it requires just as much force to raise it. The spirit shows itself so impoverished, and he's got this beautiful metaphor, that like a wanderer out in the desert who is craving a drink of water because they're actually, dying of thirst, they will take anything that somebody puts in front of them. This is Hegel's criticism of these forms of philosophy or forms of culture that are making appeals to intuition, that they're basically just a cup of water, or who knows what, being offered to the thirsty traveler who is spirit, who actually needs both sides of these.
Ooh, I was right. I was right on the money with that, right? Like, it seems that, yeah, like I said, when you get up from that chair, right, when you try to get beyond this idea of the divine or anything like that, and you try to focus on the world and try to explain the world and stuff like that, you realize that there's so much missing, and you have to have a better understanding of everything. The human mind is driven, or has a deep desire for that transcendent feeling. And if you don't watch yourself, you can find yourself going back the other way, going back into that transcendent, that divine kind of mentality. But like you said here, it's like a a man in the desert, looking for anything to sate their thirst. You just stumble into anything that seems like it's giving you that feeling of going beyond, and that interconnectedness with everything. And that's how people can get into new religions that are just as problematic or even more problematic than where you left from. So it requires you to once again build that system, have a better idea of the world, and be able to have a transcendent feeling, but not be so comfortable in that's the only way for you to explain the world, and you try to you have the idea of the mechanism and all this other stuff that gives you that greater sense of comfort, but that doesn't also encourage you to atrophy yourself. So I don't know if I'm making
Spirit
sense.
has been lacking this so much in the secularized, modernizing world, that it will take just about anything that offers itself as that, without being critical, without actually seeing whether it really is the divine, whether it really is representing something metaphysical, something transcendent or not. And Hegel sees this as a real problem. So he says, by the little which now satisfies spirit, we can measure the extent of its loss. So we see the discussion of loss and estrangement that took place in paragraph 7 being used now to talk about why people are willing to jump into, to take sort of if we want to use a Kierkegaardian phrase, a leap of faith into some sort of super sensible beyond.
Mm.
And the last thing to say about this is that this is really a problematic that is coming about because of how not just other thinkers, but especially Immanuel Kant has framed things. You know, there is a sort of scission running through. This is the world that we can actually have knowledge about, the empirical. This is what science can actually deal with. This is the realm of metaphysics. And theoretical metaphysics for Kant really can't do much of anything. In the practical world, well, in the practical side of this, rather, where we're dealing with practical reason and ethics, there we can make a bit more progress, there's a bit more traction, but none of this is strictly speaking knowable. And there's really no back and forth between these available after Kant does his work. And so you might say, what Hegel's doing here is he's seeing where the Kantian problematic goes to, and then he's going to try to get past it.
I don't know much about Kant, but
this modest complacency in receiving, or this sparingness in giving, does not, however, befit science. Whoever seeks mere edification, whoever wants to shroud and amidst the manifold variety of his earthly existence and of thought.
Oh, now I understand that. I understand that a lot more now. Whoever seeks mere edification, something about that, you know, especially knowing that edification stands for self-improvement. And again, that's related very much to kind of how the world is now, where people are seeking self-improvement just for the sake of improvement, right? Like productivity just to be productive, you know, being busy just to be busy, have this people that once again that narcissistic spiritualism of thinking that the whole point of improving yourself is just to improve yourself, right? So yeah, I understand what he was talking about now.
In order to pursue the indeterminate enjoyment of this indeterminate divinity, may look where he wishes to find all this. He will find enjoyment of this indeterminate variety of his earthly existence and of thought. Seeks mere edification, whoever wants to shroud and amidst the manifold variety of his earthly existence and of thought, in order to pursue the indeterminate enjoyment of this indeterminate divinity, may look where he wishes to find all this. He will find ample opportunity to dream up something for himself. But philosophy must beware of the wish to be edifying.
Right. Yep.
So Hegel concludes this passage by saying philosophy must beware of the wish to be edifying. And why is that? Well, as you're going to realize, edification and edifying are dirty words in the phenomenology. They're what philosophy oftentimes gets reduced to, and thereby becomes less than philosophy. And Hegel wants to avoid that like the plague. Another word for edifying would be upbuilding, or, you know, think about the notion that we have that you often see in a lot of contemporary education, that we're supposed to meet the learner not only where they are, but where they're comfortable, and then, you know, try to bring them a little bit closer. And if we can't get them all the way, well, that's okay, because we made a little bit of progress. That's what edification means. That's one way to sort of wrap your head around it. And what Hegel's criticizing still in this passage, he's still talking about these views on philosophy that reduce it to trying to train our intuition to be able to grasp something divine, something transcendent, something supersensible, and leave behind the empirical world. The problem is that gets very, very hazy. Like he said in the passage just before this, it's like somebody who's so thirsty that they'll take anything that you offer them to drink, and they'll be satisfied with it because they're getting something at least. And that's what happens with edification. It's a matter of, he talks about complacency. I like to frame this in terms of low expectations. Now, that's not to say that we automatically ought to have super high expectations that can't possibly be meta-philosophy. I actually run across this many times in my videos where viewers are looking for something to be made totally clear for them, which can't really be made totally clear for them because it requires some involvement, some effort on their part, some careful reading quite often. I see this with a lot of students as well. People want to say, what's your definition of this? And you know, real philosophy doesn't proceed by starting with definitions and then, you know, proceeding deductively, you know, to produce arguments. That's sort of a story that we tell people about philosophy. That as soon as you start reading a lot of real philosophy, you realize, well, that was a great oversimplification. To use Wittgenstein's analogy, that's sort of like doing calculations about how things are going to go without taking into account air resistance.
Yeah, this is hilarious because although I said that a lot throughout the thing, but this is kind of what Jordan Peterson does, right? And I talked about this in my audio journal where he criticizes um postmodernism, right, a lot, basically equates it to the devil. But he's doing the same thing, right? He's not really engaging with the idea of postmodernism. He's trying to define it in a specific way and then attacking that definition that he made up for it. But when you actually read about these postmodernists, I haven't read them myself, but I've listened to and I've watched like a lot of these YouTube videos where they show these. They go into detail about what these different postmodernists were talking about. And the first thing you learn is that, first of all, there is no such thing as postmodernism or postmodernists. Like a lot of the quote unquote postmodernists don't call themselves postmodernists, right? That name is given to them by people who are trying to put them all in the camp and trying to, like people like Jordan Peterson, trying to make them seem as enemies or seem as this one monolithic thing, right? When in reality, it's a lot of people, a lot of philosophers, a lot of scientists, trying to describe the world in a way that they understand it, and trying to come up with their own understandings of the world and all this other stuff. And it's in different subject areas, in which their ideas kind of make sense. Like, for instance, the postmodernism specifically in terms of media, or ideas, or rather, uh, ideas of dissecting media, right? And versus another area, which is also often conflated into postmodernism, which is this idea of dissecting power structures, right? All these things are not necessarily related, but people see general patterns like, oh, they're dissecting things, so we're going to call them all the same thing. And so when you try to define a philosophy by this specific thing, you're not engaging in philosophy, right? You're engaging and almost like strawmanning, right? You're coming up with this idea of what this is, and you haven't, especially if you haven't delved into the full work of what these people are talking about. And this is the whole point of this is the entire point of Hegel's uh preface here in his whole book. He's saying here that you can't adequately describe or preface or summarize philosophy with just a few words or a few, a preface. You have to get into the entire thing before you can criticize that thing, before you can say, hey, that thing is wrong, or that thing is right, or he's wrong about it, he's right about it. If you have not engaged with the entire idea of it, you have not engaged with the idea of it at all. You can't just have a Cliff's Notes version. You can't just have a definition, a little definition of this thing, and saying, oh yes, that's what this whole thing is about, and I disagree with it. Like, no, that's not philosophy. That's just grandstanding. That's just what he says before, being comfortable in this absolute idea of what you think is um, the description of everything. Like, if you really want to engage in philosophy, you have to engage with it. You have to get in there and understand all these different areas of it, and understand the system, the mechanisms, and how it all interplays. And then you can say, okay, maybe I disagree with that part or this part or whatever, right? But you have to engage with it. So yeah, this is awesome.
Air resistance is there because it's real. And there's a lot more thought resistance than there is air resistance. Going back to this, so having low expectations about what philosophy ought to provide, about what it is that we're trying to do when we're using our minds. Because remember, philosophy for Hegel is this totalizing activity that has to become completely scientific, completely systematic. It is going to literally encompass everything. That's what I mean by totalizing. It's going to take in the totality and make it intelligible. That's a much higher expectation than, well, it'll give me something I can believe so I can wake up each day and feel a little bit better about myself.
Right.
Or it'll give me something that I can chat about with other people and have some common ground. Or
I know. I need to stop pausing. I mean, this is probably like 2 hours now, but like, goodness, like you see that all the time, right? Where people get into philosophy or this, that, and the other just because they want to converse about it. They want to, seem smart. They want to, they want to be trying to in front of girls or in front of their friends or in front of their professor or whatever, or on YouTube comments, right? They want to seem smart. They just want to be able to know a little something about it. But in doing so, you're taking away the entire point of it. You're taking away the entire point of philosophy, of getting into that idea of it. it's so much more than just, oh, I need to believe in something, because believing in, I can't believe in nothing or whatever, right? It's like, no, it's engage with the entire idea, and really consider all this other thing. Like, oh my gosh, I'm repeating myself, but yeah, I feel that. I felt that.
We can pick a number of different lowered expectations about philosophy. In this case, the lowered expectation is that, well, it'll give me something. It's not something really clear or something that I can wrap my head around too easily, but it's something that'll like get me on the path to intuition, something that'll sound cool, something that'll sound kind of mystical, if we want to put it in contemporary terms. And, you know, that's attractive to a lot of people. Hegel thinks that that's, on the part of the person receiving, that's a matter of low expectations. On the part of the one giving, it's a form of stinginess. You're not actually giving people enough to go on. You're not actually providing them with something that they can really sink their teeth into, and if we want to continue that metaphor, not only find some meat, but draw some blood and some sustenance from it. So the giving, the receiving, the philosopher, the culture that's taking that in, and producing other philosophers in turn who are also going to be equally stingy in giving. I mean, Hegel would not only be willing to say this about this kind of fuzzy-duzzy, mystical, intuition-based philosophy, I think he'd be willing to say that about a lot of other forms of philosophy as well. If he were around today and looking at contemporary analytic philosophy, that would actually fit this bill as well, because the expectations are so low, the horizons are so low that you can't actually fit anything really substantive and interesting and historically based in it. And it tends to produce people who are rather stingy in giving. And you know, when they teach philosophy, they often turn people off from philosophy. Same thing would go, by the way, for a lot of continental philosophy, which tends to be just oriented around critique or cultural studies or things like that. They've lost a sense of the whole, of the totality, of the whole business of philosophy. So there's one other thing that he says in here that I think is important. He says, whoever seeks mere edification, which is what we're talking about here, and wants to shroud in a mist the manifold variety of his earthly existence and of thought. So Hegel is saying that edification, what it's missing is the variety of experience and thought. It's not doing justice to our actual lived experience as human beings. And by the way, part of our experience includes being thinking beings. And part of that experience includes running into thoughts that other people already thought before you and articulated, and that are waiting there like, you know, a bounty for you to actually latch onto and start exploring. That's part of what's being left out by this way of doing philosophy that has low expectations and sort of stinginess in giving, that merely edifies without doing real philosophy. And he finishes here by saying, in order to pursue the indeterminate enjoyment of this indeterminate divinity, they can look where they like to find all this. Why? Because they'll find ample opportunity to dream up something for themselves. So if this is your model for philosophy, that it's really just edification, and that it's going to be based on, you know, this sort of lack on this side and a lack on this side that reinforce each other, why do people like that? Well, because it leaves them free to dream, to daydream. Not to dream in the sense of, you know, creative dreaming where they're actually, you know, sketching out what they're going to do, something that would actually do some justice to this incredible world that we live in and these incredible beings that we are, but rather to do the kind of hazy, I just kind of like this idea, and I'm gonna explore it. I'm gonna ride my hobby horse, in the old sense of it. It lends itself to any sort of desire, any sort of motif or theme that one would like, just so long as one allows it to remain kind of hazy and doesn't question it and doesn't expect any rigor from it. As soon as one starts to do that, it falls apart. That's why edification doesn't satisfy, because edification doesn't go far enough. Edification does not provide us with the rigor that real philosophy ought to.
Oh, buddy, that was great. Wow. Let me pause this before it starts up. Yeah, that was phenomenal. Definitely, I see that point there. Oops. Let me stop sharing here. There we go. So yeah, that was that section. And like I think earlier I mentioned that too, or I was kind of almost going into that problem of thinking that yes, it's okay to just do it for edification, for self-improvement, because that's kind of how I started on much of this path. But with that, at least in my terms of self-improvement, I like to go beyond, right? Just assuming that this is the way things are, and like, oh yeah, this is a hazy, I can be okay with this hazy idea. Like for me, no, I have to dive into the things. I can't just say, oh yeah, I'm okay with this general idea of how, things work. I have to dive into it, and I've done that for a long time now. Like I used to make daily blogs, where I would dive into different things I'm learning, like capitalism and communism. I wrote entire blogs about this stuff because I wasn't okay with just saying, oh yes, capitalism is great, communism is terrible, or the other way, communism is great, we need to go towards communism, and capitalism is evil. Like no, I needed to dive into it. I need to understand why this is bad, why this is good, what's happened there, and all this other stuff. And I had to really engage with these ideas in order for me to feel comfortable, or feel some level of comfort with them. And maybe that's an advantage of my kind of weird brain, where I don't feel comfortable in a chair all day. I don't feel comfortable just, being okay with this one thing. Maybe that's because of where I came from. Like I've seen too many people who were too comfortable with, one idea of the world, and I resolved to not do that. But also I like still fall into these areas of being like, maybe I can be okay with this general idea. But no, I think it's good to be to have to grapple with these ideas and these concepts, and things like that, right? um Shoot, like this is like the entire YouTube channel, like me making all these videos about these different things I'm learning is because I want to grapple with things. I want to dive in there and be more engaged with this stuff, and make sure I'm sharing my thoughts, because I found that when I'm reading things, just regularly reading things or watching videos, I tend to do so a little bit passively, right? I'm just like generally just taking the information just because it's interesting or whatever. But when I say, oh, I'm going to make a comment on this, right? I'm going to comment on this stuff, I'm going to talk about it, or I'm going to write in the comments, or I'm going to, do something about it. I have to be more engaged. It forces me to be more active with my learning process. And that's why I make these videos. That's why I comment on YouTube. I comment on too many stuff. um I try to tone it down because sometimes it's a waste of time because a lot of other people don't want to engage in that conversation. But I when I let myself, be active with it, it encourages me to engage with these ideas more and to learn things, not just because it's interesting or because whatever, but because I want to dive into this and I want to understand everything about it, and I want to, or at least as much about it as I can at the time. And it I think it helps me to really grasp things more and to retain things more, and to be able to describe things better, to be able to um, argue or debate, about it a little bit better. So yeah, that was great. I'm really looking forward to doing more of this. I'm thinking about live streaming this, right? But tomorrow I'm gonna try to live stream. I fear that I'm gonna it's gonna be dangerous in terms of like me. I might just go on Twitch one day tomorrow, most likely, and just read or go through the rest of these chapters. Like go through two more sections of this and do this live on on a Twitch stream, just because I'm curious to see if other people would be as engaged as me, and if it will help me to be even more engaged, right? To engage in this in a dialectic, in a conversation, to hear other people, see how other people are thinking about this and learning about this sort of thing, and see if we can come up with a, have a conversation about this stuff, and see if I am able to grasp more about this concept through that mechanism. um so I do want to try that tomorrow, and we'll see where that goes. I'm scared because I'm worried that Twitch, or really any place online, is not a good place for this. That because I was doing a little bit of research to see if anybody else was doing this sort of thing, and I couldn't find anybody like learning on Twitch or Big O or any of these live streaming platforms. I just see people talking about random stuff, or even when people who are supposedly learning things are just really criticizing super negative, like people are talking about socialism or whatever, or capitalism. They're talking about it from a very negative aspect, and just poo-pooing on ideas, and not really engaging in topics or anything like that, and just trying to one up people or whatever. And I'm just really worried that I might go on Twitch or any of these platforms and people just get in there like, oh, what you doing? Blah, blah, and not really engaging in the, the conversation and stuff like that. But we'll see. We'll see. I want to experiment with it. And if it works, it works. That'd be great. If it doesn't, oh well, I'll continue just doing this, just doing it like this. Hopefully, my one of my goals here is to eventually start building up a community here on my YouTube so that people can engage with me, engage in the comments. When I start getting comments about this stuff, then maybe I'll feel more comfortable doing a live stream with everybody and stuff like that. So yeah, even if this experiment doesn't work out tomorrow, at the very least, eventually, whenever I start growing my YouTube channel more consciously, I'll be able to do that sort of thing with my community here. So with that being said, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. And I hope you learned something today. Hope you engaged in this dialectic so far. And let me know what you think. I would love to know what you think about any of this, about my thoughts on it, about Dr. Segel's descriptions and explanations, and about the book itself. So yeah, thank you and have a great day. See you. Bye-bye.